You're listening to the No Bullshit Vegan Podcast, episode 195. Agrologist Cory Davis joins me to discuss the environmental benefits of plant-based food agriculture.
Welcome to the No Bullshit Vegan Podcast. Myth-busting and evidence-based advice to help you kick butt with your health and fitness on a vegan diet. Here's your host, Karina Inkster.
Hey, welcome to the show. I'm Karina, your go-to no BS vegan fitness and nutrition coach. Thanks for tuning in today. I've been pretty busy lately with an annual music festival that I co-direct, the Cathet Accordion Fest, happening here in Powell River for the fourth year in only a few weeks. We've got 10 performing artists, 4 workshops, an 11-piece accordion band, and 2 concerts that I perform in, so it's a lot to organize and prep for and rehearse for. And our opening night concert is also the official release event for an album that my performance partner and I recorded this past summer with our 5-piece tango band. We went old school and we got it pressed on vinyl, but it is also going to be available on all streaming services. So if you're curious about all these accordion antics, go to accordionfest.com. And then in my regular job of fitness and nutrition coaching, I'm going to be one of the speakers at the 2025 Nanaimo Veg Fest. So if you're on Vancouver Island, it would be awesome to see you there. And if you want to level up your strength training and plant-based nutrition, check out our coaching programs at karinainkster.com/coaching. 3 episodes ago, I spoke with dietitian Visanto Melina. And last episode, I spoke with her co-author, Brenda Davis. And today, I'm speaking with Brenda's son, Cory Davis. Cory is a licensed professional agrologist with over 10 years of experience in natural resource and environmental management. He's a co-author of Plant-Powered Protein, Nutrition Essentials and Dietary Guidelines for All Ages, along with Visanto Melina and Brenda Davis, where he breaks down the environmental impacts of different protein choices. He also recently co-authored a paper in the Annals of Medicine titled Health Disparities and Climate Change in the Marshall Islands. His favorite vegan meal is a Buddha bowl, which I believe is also Brenda's favorite meal. And as a side note, I love prepping 5 or 6 of them all at once, so I've got them for the work week. Here's our conversation. Hey, Cory, welcome to the show. Thanks for speaking with me today.
Hey, Karina. Thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure.
Well, I just finished reading the book that you co-authored with Brenda Davis and Visanto Melina. So there's a whole chapter in there that I want to talk about, but congrats on that. I think that was in 2023, so not that long ago, right?
Yeah, that's right. We started working on it years before, but
That's usually how it works.
The COVID actually impacted when we were able to release because the supply chain was backed up. So it was really difficult to get it fully to print and everything.
Interesting.
But that also gave us some time to reflect upon the book and make last minute edits.
Cool.
So a really thorough book on plant protein. So anybody's interested, you can find it on Amazon at your favorite bookstore.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Well, congrats on that. I know it's not like super recent, but I talked to both Brenda Davis and Visanto Melina like right before you, and it's kind of like their latest big project, right? So it's on the menu, pun intended. I just learned what an agrologist is. So Google tells me that it's a professional who applies scientific knowledge to the environment, agriculture, and natural resources. Is that correct?
Brilliant. Yes. It
is Google right?
The art and science of food production. So we are very interdisciplinary. You'll find pure soil scientists, ranchers, horticulturalists, fertilizer producers. We're all under this umbrella of agrology and in British Columbia. And my particular area of expertise or my field is environmental conservation within the professional association, which is quite broad, landscape level style thing. Sometimes I've been working on project specific stuff, but oftentimes it allows me to just pull out and look at bigger population level issues.
Right. Got it. So in the book, at least, you're focusing on environmental and planetary impacts of our food choices. Is that mostly what you're focusing on, or are there kind of large or systemic things that you're dealing with as well?
Yeah, you bet. So I do work specifically, a lot of research specifically into the socio ecological impacts of our food production. So I really like bringing the human element, the social sciences into the work I do. How does it affect people and cultures and the like as well?
Got it. Right. So, what's this paper that you recently co authored? This is health disparities and climate change in the Marshall Islands. What's the deal?
That's right. So we just got it published in October. It was in collaboration with the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. 18 years ago now, just over 18 years ago, I traveled to the Marshall Islands with my mother, Brenda Davis, and my father as well, to build out a diabetes research clinic. So this involved just transforming this abandoned place next to a hospital into a wonderful, beautiful research clinic where we took in a group of people as part of our pilot of this program and introduced lifestyle medicine to type 2 diabetes patients. And the results were fantastic. And actually, the results paper just came out as well. But so we did it, huge success. Took a long time for mom, Brenda, to get the paper out, along with a lot of really wonderful researchers who took that data and really finessed it. But 18 years later, found myself going back to the Marshall Islands. And it was actually quite a shocking experience for me because 18 years ago, the coral reefs were this wonderful, colorful, blooming place of life. You know, it was a bastion of life. You see all kinds. When I went back this time, the coral reefs were white. It was a ghost town. There was very few fish to see and behold. So it was really a shocking experience. A lot of real change occurred in the Marshall Islands since then, some for the positive, some not so much. Anyways, we had the opportunity this time to speak with the president. I gave a presentation directly to the president, Hilda Heine, wonderful individual, on the impacts of our food systems and climate change. And again, one thing that we like to do is thinking about health, the environment, and also supply chains and logistical issues. How are we getting food around to people and those social impacts? So that gave us a lot of time to reflect on our time in the Marshall Islands, as well as some of the systemic issues that have resulted in some serious health disparities. And when we talk about health disparities, what we're talking about is the different health outcomes that you might see from place to place. And if there's better health comes here and lower health comes there, well, there's a disparity. What's causing that disparity, right? And it really took this integrated systems view to really analyze what are those disparities and why are they happening. And it's a confluence of political challenges. Of course, the Marshall Islands seen several successions of colonization events, from Spain in the 1500s to Germany losing it to the Japanese, and then the United States taking over and doing all their nuclear testing in the Bikini Atolls. And that has taken away a lot of that traditional indigenous knowledge about food systems and things like that. A lot of that has been lost, but also climate change is another overlying factor for a community that is so reliant on the coral reefs. It's a culture built on the coral reefs. In fact, the islands are built on coral reefs, right? So it's so central to the culture, and to see them dying out was quite a tragedy. But if you'd like to check out that paper, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine paid for the paper to be open access to the public.
Oh, wow.
So I really encourage your listeners, if they're interested in this kind of thing, to give it a quick search on Google. It's called Health Disparities and Climate Change in the Marshall Islands, and you'll find it for free there.
That's amazing. That's a good tip. And you know what? I will link it directly in our show notes so people can just go right there.
Thank you.
That's very cool. I mean, this is like the research at the forefront of climate change and things that we can do, not just on an individual level, but also on a systemic level. And so when you say things like health disparities, what do those look like in practice?
Oh, goodness. Well, you could see it here, right in Canada. There's extreme health disparities. And health disparities can be the result of, in always is the result of many, many, many converging factors, right? So it can be several things. So it's really difficult when you say, oh, okay, if you're in a lower economic class, well, your risk of early death is much higher, right? But there's a plethora of reasons. You could just take out one, for example, cars. People in a lower socioeconomic class have higher instances of car crashes. Well, why? Well, we actually have to pay for safety. So people who can afford safer vehicles get to pay for that.
Right.
And that's a benefit of being in a higher economic class. Furthermore, lower economic class folks, they might live in more populated areas. So there's more traffic. The roads aren't as well maintained. There's all kinds of things like that. You could also look at air pollution. So for example, in Toronto, about 3% of people die directly linked to air quality. And these impacts disproportionately impact certain groups of people. You'll see immigrant communities being more impacted and lower socioeconomic status people being impacted more by air quality than others. And that's because they typically live closer to the downtown core where there's high buildings, and the buildings, they create an atmospheric inversion, meaning that there's some warmer air higher than the cooler air below because it's being trapped by the way the sun's hitting those sky-rise buildings. So it hits it on the top edge and it creates a warm layer. So all of the exhaust from the cars gets circulated down below, right? And so that increases air quality concerns and disproportionately impacts people. So that would be a health disparity. And you could also see it in farming. So there's a lot of communities in the United States. Actually, there was a really wonderful documentary that came out not too long ago called The Smell of Money. And it just did a case study of an area where there's a lot of pig farming and chicken farming, but it showed how in and around, especially within 2 kilometers of these factory farms, the air quality was so harsh that people found it difficult even to open their eyes sometimes because it would be stinging. And that, of course, results in all kinds of health issues. So the closer you are to a pig farm, the higher risk you are. And so it's really an analysis of risk factors. And unfortunately, we find that people with the greatest disparities tend to be marginalized or vulnerable community members, the people that we really want to support the most, right?
That's absolutely right. And I think this exact same thing is happening with regard to climate change. So the populations who are contributing the most to climate change and the ones who are suffering the most from its effects.
That is exactly right. Yep, the countries that emit the most pollution tend to be the most resilient to climate change for several reasons, like geographic location could be one, but also because they have the economic means to protect themselves. Canada, we're in a fairly good spot in the face of climate change because we have in part because we have so much wilderness, right? We have a small population relative to the size of land we have, which means that we get a lot more ecological services out of that. So ecosystems that can be resilient in the face of climate change events, whether or not it's wildfires, which of course we've been hit hard with, but ecological services are really important to protect ourselves against changing climate, ecological degradation, all kinds of things that can harm our health. When I think ecological services, some of the first things that comes to my mind is water filtration, water storage, water retention. I'm thinking, well, it provides wildlife habitat. That's fantastic. Recreation opportunity, but carbon sequestration as well. All kinds of services that the land provides to us, which is oftentimes not economically valuated, right? And so when we go about doing industrial operations, whether or not it's forestry or if it's clearing land to create more pasture, we don't always do the best job of evaluating the opportunity cost, which may end up being permanent.
Right.
Or at least for the foreseeable future. When I think permanent, I'm thinking 20 years down the road. If it comes back, that's fine. I think it's permanent. It's a generation.
Mm-hmm.
If we were able to start economically evaluating it, perhaps we could have a better argument for the protection of certain areas. But this is really alarming to me when I think about the ecological services that we've lost or are currently compromised when I think agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Agriculture is perhaps one of the biggest, if not the biggest, environmental impact on the planet, right? Because it uses the most land. And so if you're going to convert a piece of land into something different than what it was, convert an ecosystem, well, you have to replace certain ecological services with new services. So if you're clearing a forest for pasture, well, you've removed a lot of the carbon sequestration potential, the wildlife habitat, a lot of the water storage and water retention capabilities, so much else, and you're replacing it with a different service, the service of growing food, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cattle. And unfortunately, it's a very inefficient process when raising cattle
Mm-hmm.
or even other livestock as well. But cattle perhaps is the most egregious land use intensive product out there other than lamb and goat meat. So mutton.
Right. Yeah, which I don't think are as commonly consumed.
Not in North America.
Right. Good point. Well, in your chapter in plant-powered protein, you say that shifting the dietary patterns of populations must be a priority for policymakers if we are to stand any chance of mitigating the effects of climate change. So here's a little bit of background for you and then a question around this concept, okay? So just a couple days ago, I was attending a meeting in my city, which is Powell River, that was hosted by our local Climate Alliance. And so the whole purpose of this meetup was to build more effective public voices, or one kind of more condensed public voice, by collaborating with all these different individuals and groups that are all working on really important projects, but kind of in silo form, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's supposed to be a gathering of like-minded people, climate change focused. So, we had people like teachers who run environmental clubs at their schools. There was a collective there working to ban certain pesticides. There's a group there working to get oil and gas companies to pay their fair share for their impacts on climate change. A bunch of writers and journalists, a whole bunch of types, right? So everyone at this meeting is very seriously concerned about the impacts of climate change. But as usual, in gatherings like this, nobody's vegan. And so, I do think it's important to recognize that being vegan is a privilege, and we actually do need to put a lot of work into systemic issues like food insecurity. But people who attend meetings like this, they're typically middle-class professionals.
Mm-hmm.
They're living in one of the richest countries in the world. 99% of them could go vegan if they wanted to. And as we all know, being plant-based is one of the most impactful actions we can take on an individual level to impact climate change. So why do you think more people who are seriously concerned with climate change and they've done the research and they're in that world, why are more folks not vegan?
Yeah, brilliant question. I have a couple different responses. First, in academia, there was a paper published not all that long ago from Harvard University, I think it was last year, where they surveyed all of the environmental climate scientists and asked about the priority of reducing meat consumption to action climate change. They had a 94% consensus that specifically in higher income countries, we need to reduce vastly, transition to going plant-based. So huge consensus on that front. I mean, Chatham House report, biodiversity loss and food systems report, not all that long ago either. They really highlighted that it's an imperative that, especially in middle to higher income countries, that we start making the transition to go plant-based. It is a necessity, not only for direct emissions, which is something to be concerned about, the methane emissions, but it's about the opportunity cost of the land.
Mm-hmm.
So we've lost 1/3 of our forests and 70% of our grasslands to agriculture. This is a massive amount of land. I mean, bigger than United States and Brazil combined, right? Like this is a huge area, 40% or more of the total land mass of planet Earth, right? And 77% of that is used for animal agriculture to grow their feed or graze. Huge amounts of land, the opportunity cost of which is like the United Nations they say that ecosystems and biodiversity, right, which is lost when we convert forest into pasture or wild grasslands into pasture, is our greatest defense against climate change, right? So there's huge potential to be tapped here by rewilding and restoring these ecosystems using a more land efficient diet. Like we could reduce the amount of area we currently use to produce food and still feed everybody quite well, like very, very well.
I've seen stats up to 75%. If no one ate meat and dairy,
that's right.
Farmland globally would reduce by 75% and still feed everyone.
That's right. Yeah, and still feed everyone. So there's enormous opportunity space to work within there, right? Even if we're just reducing it by 25% or 50%, that's a huge, huge win. I think the road to Veganville, as Tobias Lenhart, and forgive me if I pronounce his last name wrong, puts it, really requires a pragmatic approach, one that the vegan community hasn't really adopted.
How do you mean?
Because it is such a heart-wrenching thing. Animal suffering. It really alarms people and it makes them want to go to war. They want to resolve this now. It's number one priority. And in reality, like policy change and all these things, it takes time. It takes cultural shift. It takes meeting people where they're at. And I think that the response in the public sphere to the sort of militant style of vegan messaging has really put up a lot of people's defenses. So vegan is oftentimes, in my social circles at least, is kind of like a nasty word.
It has baggage.
Right? It has baggage. It's like, well, can we even enjoy a meal with him? Because, we're going to eat our burgers and he's just going to yap about animal agriculture and how we need to go vegan or whatever it might be. So I really think that as a vegan community, we really need to be people-centered and people-focused. And especially when we're eating food needs to be a time that everybody enjoys. It can't be a place of politics, and especially food politics.
Yes.
Food is already like an incredibly sensitive thing. Imagine promoting a vegan diet to an Indigenous community here in Canada, right? After we've taken almost everything away from them, their land, their laws, their philosophy, Indigenous knowledge, family members, they're taking their children. And then to go to them and say, well, you know what, the way you eat is unethical. That's not where we're at, right? And whenever I bring up we should all go vegan, the world, that's what people will point to the most, right?
Yes.
They'll say, well, what about the Indigenous populations? What about this and that? And in reality, it's not going to be like everybody's going to go vegan at once. What I really want to promote is transitioning our global food supply chain to become more plant-based, right? There will be pockets where regionally meat or dairy or whatever might be very culturally significant, and it might remain in these pockets, especially regions where they might have real bad food insecurity or whatnot. And we've really got to be culturally sensitive when we go about making change out there. So I'm not one to necessarily promote veganism on that sort of global stage. I tend to do that more interpersonally with my friends and so forth. But what I really want to see is progress transition to a more plant predominant agricultural supply chain. That way we don't get the backlash, the emotional defense mechanisms that might come up as much. We might, especially if ranchers and livestock producers start transitioning out of the industry and protesting and so forth, that could cause a lot of public angst against those people promoting the change, right? So it's incredibly complex. And there's a lot of propaganda out there from the meat industry.
Good point.
Which is another reason why I think people aren't making the transition as quickly as I would like. Like Happy Egg Co., they do all of their marketing with these happy chickens on a pasture or whatever. But in reality, the investigations show, no, these chickens do not have a real nice life. I think perhaps one of the most brilliant marketing tactics has been from the cattle industry. And I don't know if it was by design or if it just organically happened that way. But everybody knows ranchers, or at least I do. They're my peers. They've been my neighbors. You see the happy ranching family herding cattle down the road to a pasture, or whatever, this happy-go-lucky family. And they are typically looking small scale. You see them as you drive down BC highways behind the fences. You'll see this picturesque, homogeneous pasture, looks really beautiful, but is ecologically damaged because the desired state is homogeneous. And of course, you need heterogeneity in the landscape to accommodate biodiversity. You need differences here and there, right? So it's quite the thing. And so we see that's the public face of the beef industry,
right?
As you see. And with that, the politics of that, well, if you're a politician, if you want to become a change maker, that's a real tough group to try and go up against.
Well, then you're also talking about things like subsidies and what types of foods are subsidized, what types of food growing operations are and aren't. There's big differences there too.
Cattle ranching is actually not very lucrative at all. So they're often straddling the lines of profitability. This is true at almost every stage of the supply chain, including the family ranchers. There are some ranches that do very well, oftentimes the larger ranches, but oftentimes you might even get a very well-off person just buying a ranch for the lifestyle.
Right.
Lots hemorrhage money. Oftentimes, they're just straddling that line of profitability. And to offset that, well, they've got to improve productivity and efficiency. And unfortunately, that results in all kinds of animal welfare concerns. So, for example, that first stage in the supply chain, those ranching families, often just absolutely wonderful. Some of the best people I've met come from ranching families, can be pillars of the community, often very thoughtful people who want to do the right thing. But those cows that you see them herding, well, they raise them to maybe 9 to 11 months of age. That's about 11 years in human years. They get up to about 600 to 900 pounds at this stage before they get auctioned off in the fall to a factory farm, which is the feedlot. What most people don't know is that you might be buying beef that says it's local, but it might not actually be. It's part of the supply chain mechanism. So you raise the cattle to 9 to 11 months of age, then you auction it off in the fall. About 90% or more of the cattle in British Columbia get auctioned off to just 3 massive concentrated animal feeding operations concentrated animal feeding operations. That's an American term, CAFOs. Here in Canada, we call them ILOs, intensive livestock operations.
Okay.
In Alberta. So they actually cross the Rocky Mountains to Alberta and actually there's a place called Feedlot Alley, I believe. It's quite near Lethbridge in Alberta, but it's absolutely massive. It's like a feedlot region. Real mind-blowing to see sort of the satellite imagery of this area. But over 90% of them are auctioned off in the fall, transported to Alberta to just 3 massive concentrated animal feeding operations. These CAFOs or ILOs, these are huge, huge factory farms. They'll be fed a diet of grain, perhaps some legumes. They'll grow maybe 2 to 3 pounds a day over the course of 7 to 9 months, where they'll be brought up to slaughter weight, which is about 1,400 pounds at just 16 years of age in human years. But really, they're about 18 months of age or so at this time, at which point they get processed. And that's the industry term for slaughter. They call it processing, where they're cut up and then manufactured, wrapped in plastic, and oftentimes sent back to British Columbia, sometimes sent back to the original ranchers who raised the cattle to a certain point, and then it's sold to British Columbians. But we don't see those 2 extra stages, right? We don't see that it goes to these big feedlots.
Interesting.
Actually, another percentage, about a couple percent, actually go to the United States, to Seattle from British Columbia. They get auctioned off there. Typically in the United States, they feed their cattle corn. We feed our cattle mostly barley in Canada. And it helps differentiate, right? Like between Canadian beef versus American beef. It results in different quality, textures, tastes. So we have our Canadian beef, and barley is a really good feed product because it does take relatively less water. we're in the right temperate climate to grow barley. I, of course, promote that we should eat barley because it's delicious and
course.
nutritious, but we feed maybe 80% of our barley to cattle.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the side of the industry that we don't see.
This is very interesting. I did not know that.
And it doesn't work its way into the public sphere, right? So we typically think of beef and we think of these small operations, and certainly the scale doesn't often hit home, right? Because the scale of the industry is absolutely massive. Even though we have a fairly small industry in BC, I think it's 10 million cows or something like that. It pales in comparison to like the prairies or somewhere like that. But it's still a huge resource. And we do see forest being lost in British Columbia to make way for cattle expansion, pasture expansion, are grasslands. So typically we would want cattle to graze grasslands, right? Rather than converting forest to grassland. I mean, it's more work for the ranchers and everybody, but our grasslands here in British Columbia, they're typically dry, right? Like we see in the Okanagan. And those grasslands didn't evolve with cattle like herbivory, right? So one of the things that's being promoted now more than ever is this idea of regenerative grazing.
Right.
It's something I hear in my professional association. It's always promoted. I actually welcome regenerative type practices. I think it's a really great thing. What I was focusing on when I was talking about the supply chain, profitability is really difficult, right? So we have to increase productivity. And that's why we have the feedlots, right? It's the most efficient way to bring them up to slaughter weight quickly. They don't get to live their 20 plus year lives. They 18 months of age or however, and they're already at 1,400 pounds, get them to slaughter, boom, go again, the cycle, right? Because that's the point. That's the defense mechanism against fluctuating prices for beef. Regenerative grazing, however, it has a huge bar to jump over, because in order to implement regenerative grazing practices, you have to sacrifice productivity. You have to sacrifice productivity. So how do we go about doing that in an industry that's already on a lifeline of public support? Subsidized cheap land for grazing, like cattle in British Columbia, they graze public lands for very low prices, albeit the upfront cost is quite high because fencing is very expensive. We're talking $25,000 plus per kilometer. And these areas need to be fenced for public safety. And these range tenures, they're absolutely massive, right? They're absolutely massive, huge. They pretty much cover all of British Columbia, to be honest with you. Not that everyone is utilized and not that cattle use all the space within those tenures, just the pasture areas. So don't let it deceive you and think that cattle are absolutely everywhere. They're not. For regenerative grazing, you need about 5 times more land. Well, at least double the land to start those kinds of practices. And so if you're working within a particular area, you're going to have to sacrifice productivity. I'm all for that. I mean, if it reduces the amount of cows that go to slaughter and it improves conditions on the land, fantastic. But the fear is that they're not going to compromise productivity, right? It's an industry, so they have to fight for the industry's interests. And with that would come perhaps expansion requests, right? To accommodate the same number of cows, but using more land. That's the huge fear with regenerative grazing, is the demand isn't decreasing at the same rate as productivity would be lost going to these practices, these regenerative practices. So there's a huge disconnect between the public perception about the regenerative grazing, its ability to sequester carbon into the soils, and, grazing is great for the land. Not if we're using up all the land. And grazing is great for the land. This is another trick that we've all been duped into with regenerative grazing and cattle ranching in general, is they will say, we are stewards of the grasslands, right? I'm not sure if you've heard that before, but it's being touted by the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, even BC Cattlemen Association. They like to think of themselves as stewards of the grassland. And I think that's an honorable thing to aspire to be, for sure. That's a great goal. However, the way I feel about it is it's really tough, because the interface between livestock and wildlife, that nature versus pasture, the wild grassland versus the pasture, that area is characterized, and Johan Dutoit, a researcher in the United States, said it absolutely brilliantly, that the wildlife livestock interface is characterized by management actions aimed at controlling depredation, predator-prey interaction. So you want to reduce how many wolves are preying on your cattle. I mean, if you lose just one cow, that can hit, because you're just straddling that line of profitability, that could be a huge economic loss for you. So you really want to manage for depredation, forage. How I would characterize livestock management on the land is you're thinking animal units, unit months. So how much, and an animal unit month is how much forage is available on the land to feed an animal for a month, right? So you calculate, well, how much grass is there on the land, right? So competition for forage is a huge thing. That was one of the drivers why we eradicated what we called wild horses in British Columbia that were introduced by the Spanish. Turned out that most of these horses, if like a lot of them, were actually owned by indigenous groups who were managing the herds, but we just thought of it as well. But they were competing with cattle for forage, so we killed them all in British Columbia. So that's another thing. So characterized by depredation, forage management. So you want to reduce competition for forage, and disease. So diseases like bovine tuberculosis that you can find in elk. It's a disease that was introduced to wildlife from cattle in the first place. But now that it's in wildlife, now they're trying to protect cattle from the disease that the wildlife carry, disease that was introduced by cattle.
Right.
Another example of this exact thing is brucellosis. You can find it in bison as well, mostly in the Yellowstone Park area. But that was another disease that was introduced to bison from cattle in the first place. And now all the management actions are aimed at reducing the interaction between cattle and that wildlife to prevent transmitting the disease. And you never hear about that. We never hear about, we've got to prevent the transmission of disease to wildlife. No, it's about protecting our economic assets that are cattle. So those three things: depredation, I'll say it again, competition for forage, and disease. Right? That's how we characterize how we manage our rangelands and our grasslands for pasture in particular. And with that, we remove wildlife, right? Naturally, over time, stewards of the grassland, I don't think would want to remove bison, but cattle ranchers militantly also want to kill bison, especially in the Montana area, right? And in other areas where they're bison, they don't want to see fences taken down, fences meant for livestock taken down to accommodate the migration of bison.
Right.
So there's all this infrastructure in the way of us actually creating real nice grasslands that provide us with ecological benefits. With that said, yeah, we don't want too many deer. We don't want too many wolves. So we don't want wolves eating our cattle. Well, so we call a bunch of wolves. Well, now there's too many deer. So what do? You call the deer because you don't want the deer competing for forage, or the elk or whatever. And it's, it's a win-win, because if you call the elk, then you're also reducing risk of disease transmission from bovine tuberculosis. So yeah, stewards of the grasslands indeed. And they're aiming to have a homogeneous landscape. I mentioned this, right? Because it's a lot easier to manage if it's just like a soccer field of grass, right? But a natural ecosystem, it has a lot of variable characteristics. The little hills, the little wetland here, there's a tree patch there, there's bush, like willows and like things like this that, moose really like, and all this. No, you just kind of, if you're growing cattle, if you're raising it, you kind of just want that soccer field,
right?
This homogeneous grass. So over time, you'll see these ecosystems slowly transform to maximize beef production. So you're maximizing how many pounds of beef you could get per hectare of area at the expense of these other the wetlands, the wildlife habitat, the deer, the elk, the bison, who we have replaced in the Great Plains largely with cattle. Stewards of the grassland. So they say these ecosystems need to be grazed because, of course, they evolved to or co-evolved with native grazers, right? And so these ecosystems actually require it. It's very healthy for the ecosystem. They need to be grazed. And livestock producers, well, Well, we have the solution. We have the cattle to graze the land.
It's not the whole story.
What that tells to me is that they've kind of stolen an ecological niche. Because grazing is an ecological function that can be part of an animal's ecological niche on the landscape. You're grazing for forage, right? So you're taking a wild native animal's ecological niche and you're replacing with a cow. As we know, there's this very famous quote. I'm trying to remember who said it. And my apologies to the person who did. I believe, rest in peace, he's not alive anymore. But he said, one man can survive off of 300 trout a year. 300 trout need to eat 90,000 frogs. And the 90,000 frogs need to eat however million grasshoppers, who in turn need 1,000 tons of grass. So if trout populations decrease, well, frog populations increase, then grasshopper populations decrease and grass populations increase. There's this dynamic there. It's very simplified, but you've got to take it a step further and start applying it to the land as we see it. And when we see it in cattle pasture, well, you remove the deer or you remove the wolves, well, you're removing those trophic cascades that the wolves provide. And a trophic cascade, I'm so sorry to introduce a new term at this stage of our chat together, but it is an ecological phenomenon whereby the addition or removal of a particular animal has cascading effects throughout the ecosystem. And this is particular to predators, what I'm thinking right now. But a really good example is you remove the wolf, deer populations increase, overgrazing the land. And overgrazing can have all kinds of secondary impacts, such as nesting birds in grasslands. They need a certain amount of height of grass. There could be all kinds of impacts. But, there's a really good paper, The Trophic Downgrading of Planet Earth. It's open access by the authors of Trophic Cascades. We now know, as that paper and many other have come to realize, goes much deeper than that simplified model of the deer that I just said in the overgrazing. It can have implications on the biogeochemical exchanges in soil, water, and air. It can have impacts on carbon sequestration. It can have impacts at many different levels of the trophic web.
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot of points here that you've covered, and one of them sticks out, which is the concept of stewards of the grasslands. And it's kind of this idea or myth, if that's what you want to call it, that gets thrown around a lot when you talk to people about maybe considering eating more plant-based, or maybe considering a little bit of research into where their food is coming from. So that's something that's thrown around. The other thing that's thrown around a lot, I find in my circles anyway, is local versus imported. Like, okay, well, I support local, small scale family cattle production, exactly like the one you just described, where evidently people don't realize that those cattle are being shipped off and shipped back. But I did see a stat in 2019, Oxford University put out a paper in the Science Journal. They found that the lowest impact meat and dairy products, so we're talking like small scale, all of those things, still cause more environmental damage than the least sustainable vegetable and cereal growing, which usually involves transporting things across borders and all sorts of greenhouse gas emissions in transportation. So why is that not more public knowledge? How do we get that word out to folks who care about climate change?
What any climate scientist with a focus on agriculture should be saying is that, the carbon footprint, I guess, of the food that you're consuming is much more related to what you're eating than where it comes from. And so it is somewhat of a myth, though there's grains of truth in this idea of eating local. I think it's a real empowering personal strategy for your own growth. If you want to promote local business and so forth, I think it's really important for local economies, but doesn't matter so much as where it's coming from is what you're eating. And a real good example of this is in the UK, like they have a huge sheep growers associations and culture around sheep herding. What most people don't know is that the UK, they import 27 million tons of soy every year. Of course, the vast majority is for animal feed. On the backdrop of that, the conversation that's not being had is there's this massive vile industry of animal feed going around the world. In fact, there was a quote an independent researcher. I don't know how accurate it is, but he did some analysis. He found that 80% of starving children come from countries who grow animal feed specifically for higher income nations. Like there's huge disparities just there. If we're thinking about food security, this is not the answer. There are places in the world that can't produce animal feed, like in the Marshall Islands. I was just there. I had a tour of a pig farm. Their feed was imported from the Philippines, I believe. Canada, we're a net exporter of feed. We export a lot more feed than we import. We're one of those nations. Same with the United States. But there's a lot of places around the world who are importing feed.
Well, not to mention it takes just so many resources to create a meat product in the first place, regardless of where that feed comes from, if it's imported, if it's grown locally. The fact is, it's a very inefficient food technology.
It's resource intensive to the extreme. And so, you mentioned something at the very beginning of our conversation about veganism being a privilege. And I think it is. Like it is in a lot of cultural situations. My wife is from China. And prior to the Cultural Revolution, people weren't very affluent. So they didn't have a lot of money. And so they had to innovate. People couldn't afford meat because it's resource intensive. This is what happens when you don't put all of your food subsidies into animal products. You start seeing the actual realities. So here, if you're poor, you're probably going to McDonald's and you're eating all this processed food and meat and stuff. Subsidies, and
100%.
Not just subsidies, but a lot of public support. Like beyond what we're financially giving, there's the natural wealth of the land that we've given up very, very cheaply. And we've supported the industry through all kinds of mechanisms to streamline that food to our plates. Other places without that privilege don't get that. And so in China, they had to innovate. So they called wheat meats or mock meats and things like that.
Yes.
Super cheap, the food for the poor. And after the Cultural Revolution, when people started becoming more affluent and had more access to wealth, they stopped eating that because it was seen as, well, that's what you eat when you're poor.
Right.
And so if you can afford meat, then you will. So I had my in-laws here a year ago. They stayed with us for about a year because they want to get permanent residency in Canada. And that's part of the process. And so they're not vegetarian or anything. So it was quite something. They said that they'll eat vegan dinners with me every day. So that was amazing. And
that's great.
so we would create all of these awesome, beautiful, delicious foods for them in the evenings. And it looked so amazing that they always were taking pictures and sending it back to China. But the comments always were when they sent them back, what, you can't afford meat?
Ah, interesting.
So it's not a privilege. It's a privilege to eat meat. That's the reality. So this whole narrative about veganism being only for those privileged elites is just a fraud. It is sheer propaganda. That's not how it works in this world. If you want more resource intensive products, you need to be privileged to afford that. Right. And it's because we're in a privileged nation that we're getting these out to everybody cheaply.
Absolutely. I feel like that could be a whole other conversation too. When I say privilege, I don't mean just financial. I also mean health effects or, the mental bandwidth to make changes in our lives and all those kind of things. But I think you're right that it's context dependent, and in different areas of the world, there's different baggage and there's different meaning around eating just plants or eating meat, or some combination of those. And I think we need to take those into account. I did want to highlight one stat to kind of bring some of these topics into, like your example of lining up semi-trucks. This is from your chapter in the plant-powered protein book. It's around the resources involved in producing beef versus tofu as a comparison point, right? So non-dairy cattle on average, use 1,592 square feet of land to produce 1 pound of product. And tofu, by comparison, uses only 17 square feet for 1 pound of product. So that means beef requires more than 93 times more land than tofu per kilo of food. So for folks who kind of get the concept that, okay, yeah, maybe animal agriculture is more resource intensive and it's not a super efficient food technology, if that's what you want to call it, there's some numbers for you.
Yes. And thanks for bringing that up. if I had more time to write, or if I could have written a longer chapter or a book just on the environment, I would have made it a little bit more nuanced, because that figure in particular, that's going to take into account both grazing land and then land to crop production, right? Which have two totally different impacts. So you'll hear CBC just last year did an interview with a cattle rancher in Ontario, and the rancher was saying, oh, you know, if you wanted to replace this with vegan products, well, you'll have to convert my pasture into industrial cropland. You know, of course, that's way worse. Look at the wonderful work we're doing here, and, you know, all these beautiful landscapes. That's also propaganda. And so if we were to truly go plant-based as a global, we could actually reduce the amount of cropland we currently use by definitely over 1 million hectares. Probably, I think the figure is 240 million hectares, but I'm not quite sure off the top of my head. So that's a misnomer. It would be, well, we could actually rewild your pasture because we actually just don't need this
we
land.
just don't even need the land anyway. So
that's the message that they send. They'll say, oh, well, like, what's worse? Like, we have a few cattle out here grazing the land, or are you going to transform this into some big industrial soy crop? Like, which do you choose? And of course, if you're the public, you're like, oh yeah, of course we want a couple cows. You know, at least the birds can come. And there's no pesticides and this and that. Couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, like, when we think about pesticides, there's two groups partnered up and did this study on pesticide use, did an industry analysis. But Greenpeace wrote some good articles about this paper. Public Eye was one of the nonprofits who did this industry analysis. And they found that the feed industry, animal feed industry, is the lead driver of hazardous pesticide demand globally. When we're talking about animal feed, you're talking about huge monoculture industrial operations. For one, these crops aren't always edible for humans. Like, the soy we feed to livestock is not the same soy that you eat. It's a different strain. You know, it's not palatable for humans. So we're growing these big, massive crops, and we really want them to be homogeneous. We need them to be the exact same, because you're feeding it to animals for a corporation who wants to maintain consistency in their product.
Right. So
you have these big organizations, they want consistency, quality control. They've got to get the same feed. Feed really affects quality of your meat products. And so what we have are these massive, massive monocultural operations all across the world, growing these fairly low resource intensive crops, right? Because you really want to grow the crops that are easy to grow in your region, that don't use up a lot of resources, but we have a ton of them. And typically Monsanto, like, people don't want to eat soy. Oh, I don't want that genetically modified. Go to the grocery store, almost every package of soy will say non-GMO or organic on it. That's not the soy we're eating. Monsanto Roundup soy goes to livestock. And so that's what you're seeing. And if we were to stop using this cropland to feed animals, we could actually diversify our agricultural land base, meaning that we could reduce our vulnerability to certain pest crops. Like, imagine if something came in and started attacking a particular type of animal feed that's grown very widely. I mean, that's a huge risk. So if we can diversify these crops, fantastic. Of course, since animal agriculture or animal feed crops are the lead driver in demand for these hazardous pesticides, we could reduce those environmental impacts by converting it to crops that we actually eat. And so the narrative has just been completely derailed by the meat industry. And I really appreciate you in this podcast to give our audience a different perspective and have some counterpoints to what we find in the media and the stories they tell. So I really appreciate the time you spent with me, Karina. I'd love to chat with you again if you wanted to another time, or if your audience has further questions for me, you could collate them and share them, and we could talk about them in the future.
Absolutely. Well, Cory, thank you so much for speaking with me. I learned a lot. I feel like I'm going to re-listen to the conversation and make a whole bunch of notes. And I would love to link to the article that you mentioned in our show notes. So we'll have a direct link there. And thanks again for speaking with me.
Fantastic. Thank you too.
Cory, thank you again for joining me on the show. Access our show notes at nobullshitvegan.com/195 to connect with Cory and to read the paper he co-authored, Health Disparities and Climate Change in the Marshall Islands. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to the No Bullshit Vegan podcast at nobullshitvegan.com.